The millionaire screamed for someone who spoke Japanese. The silence nearly cost him millions. Until the cleaning lady did the unbelievable. Ruth Morgan adjusted her blue uniform in the gleam of the marble counter, where every reflection seemed to remind her how invisible her life was in the face of the grandeur of others. At 30, accustomed to carrying dignity in silence, she knew no one ever expected anything less than perfect service from her discreet hands. But that morning, the entire hotel breathed a palpable nervousness, as if the elegant walls sensed something extraordinary was about to happen. The revolving door opened with authority, revealing Alexander Sterling, the 40-year-old millionaire whose sharp gaze could tear apart careers with a single sentence. He didn't need to raise his voice much. "Does anyone here speak Japanese?" he asked, and the words struck like a hammer in the souls of those present. Silence fell heavily, dragging with it the shame of every employee who averted their eyes to the floor, as if avoiding the question were enough to escape the fury. Ruth, even with her body bent over the cleaning cloth, felt the question pierce the air to the center of her chest. It was the kind of silence in which destinies change, and she knew instinctively that the answer lay hidden where no one would ever dare look. Across the room, Adrian Whitmore, the rooftop maitre d', observed with the sharp serenity of someone who measures before acting, like a craftsman evaluating the right cut for a rare piece of wood. His elegant, discreet posture hid his eyes, attentive to every movement, as if already knowing that the unexpected would emerge from an unlikely corner. Around him, the executives held their breath. Charles Wentworth, ever skeptical, drummed his fingers on the arm of his chair as if counting the seconds of someone else's incompetence. Richard Hale, combative, was already mentally sharpening words that would hurt more than help, and Edward Langford, more restrained, stood firm, willing to listen but without any apparent weapons. Near the counter, Sophie Carter, a senior assistant, clutched her briefcase to her chest, her eyes restless, as if she had just realized that a tiny detail could become history. Each of them reacted differently, but none dared to fill the void created by the billionaire's question. Alexander spoke again, his voice now thick with impatience that bounced off the high walls like suppressed thunder. "No one?" he repeated, and the echo of his indignation seemed capable of shaming even the crystal chandeliers that hung over the room. Ruth felt the muscles in her hands tense inside her yellow gloves, the damp cloth still resting on the marble, as if that surface held the secrets of her entire life. She remembered her mother's firm voice, years before, saying, "The world may not see you, Ruth, but you must always do your work as if someone important were watching." And perhaps, in that moment, that someone important had finally arrived. With a calm sigh, she looked up for the first time and realized that the time for hiding was over. Eyes still darted away, head still lowered, but fate had already chosen its interpreter, and she was about to show that even a cleaning lady could change the course of an entire story. At the counter, Mr. Bennett, his shirt wrinkled from travel fatigue and his eyes stricken with anguish, seemingly begging for help, tried to explain himself with nervous gestures and a piece of paper scribbled in Japanese. His voice trembled, stumbling over foreign words that didn't come out as they should. "Sumimasen," he ventured, but the receptionist froze with a crooked smile, unable to offer a solution. The seconds dragged on like hours. Unease pervaded the room, and Bennett's desperation grew before everyone, who pretended not to see. Ruth observed, from the corner of her eye, the suffering displayed in this ordinary man, and recognized in his tone an urgency that wasn't mere annoyance, but almost a plea for salvation. The cleaning lady took 2 silent steps, as if fearing to disrupt the natural order of things, and approached with the discretion of someone accustomed to being invisible. His yellow gloves landed softly on the paper, and before any manager or executive could intervene, a clear sentence fell from his lips. In perfect Japanese, so perfect that it surprised even the furniture, which seemed accustomed only to the hotel's polished English. The effect was immediate. Bennett's tense face relaxed, as if a huge weight had been lifted from his shoulders, and a spark of relief crossed his gaze. Ruth spoke precisely, indicating the correct room, the meeting time, and even the names listed in the notes, restoring order to what seemed like an unsolvable puzzle. The words flowed naturally, firm but full of respect, as if carrying not only meaning but also dignity. Sophie Carter, who had been watching silently until then, clutched the folder to her chest, her heart racing, realizing that this woman everyone ignored had just revealed a secret that could change everything. In the corner, Charles raised his eyebrow, Richard inclined his head, and Edward, discreetly, let out an almost admiring sigh. Even Alexander, who had seemed distant, turned halfway, his eyes narrowing as if assessing a rare piece that had appeared out of nowhere. Ruth, however, wasn't seeking stares or applause. She stepped back unhurriedly, placed the bucket on the cart, and resumed cleaning as if nothing had happened. The lobby resumed its usual rhythm. Suitcases swirling, voices mingling, hurried footsteps. But something had changed in the air, something imperceptible to many, but undeniable to some. Adrian Whitmore, who until then had been watching in silence, approached with the calculated calm of someone who recognizes potential where no one else sees it. He didn't praise, he didn't ask. He simply said in a low, almost intimate tone, "Rooftop, now." Ruth looked up, surprised by the unexpected order, but didn't object. She felt deep down that this call wasn't an invitation. It was a door opening to a world she never imagined entering. And sometimes, the most important doors appear at the precise moment we decide to no longer live hidden. The service elevator rose slowly, releasing a low hum that vibrated beneath Ruth's feet, as if every second of the ascent carried with it the weight of an invisible decision. She stood erect, the cleaning cart in front of her like a shield, while Adrian Whitmore stood silently beside her, his enigmatic expression reflected in the stainless steel walls. Ruth felt her heart race, not because of the height they were reaching, but because of the strange certainty that this moment was a turning point. When Adrian pressed the button marked PH, she realized she was about to enter a space reserved only for the privileged few. With every meter gained, she felt further removed from the world she lived in daily, from the stairs she scrubbed and the surfaces she polished, as if she were crossing, for the first time, the border between invisibility and recognition. The doors slid open, revealing the rooftop in all its grandeur. Light flooded the space with almost poetic force, casting golden reflections on the tables already set with sparkling silverware, napkins folded in impeccable geometric shapes, and crystal glasses that transformed the sunbeams into colorful prisms. The air was fresher there, mingled with the aroma of freshly brewed coffee and subtle lavender, as if even the perfume had been chosen to convey sophistication. Ruth took a deep breath, feeling the contrast between the scent of polish still lingering on her gloves and the ambience of unattainable luxury. The glass walls offered a panoramic view of the city, the skyscrapers rising like silent witnesses to the distance separating worlds. Every detail reinforced that this floor was not just physical, but symbolic. It was the territory where destinies were decided, far from the corridors where she swept dust. Adrian led Ruth to an adjoining lounge, lined with dark leather armchairs and shelves filled with bound books, a space where even the silence seemed designed to command respect. There stood Mrs. Nakamura, in her elegant red dress that contrasted with the sobriety of the place, Patrick Collins, the senior analyst, and Edward Langford, the executive, always restrained but attentive to everything. Each gaze turned to Ruth, sizing her up, as if trying to decipher what compelled a cleaning lady to occupy such a space. Richard Hale and Charles Wentworth followed soon after, their expressions thick with suspicion, ready to question any slip-up. Ruth calmly removed her gloves, folding them on her lap as if part of a secret ritual to build courage. Mrs. Nakamura broke the silence with a question in Japanese, elegant and challenging, enough to make most stumble. Ruth looked up and answered precisely, returning the sentence as one might return a lost jewel to its rightful owner. A thick silence fell over the lounge, and at that moment, everyone realized they weren't just looking at a cleaning lady, but someone capable of turning the game's logic upside down. Patrick Collins opened a heavy folder, his hands trembling slightly as he spread out handwritten pages covered in hasty kanji and nearly illegible marginalia on the table. The last interpreter couldn't decipher this passage. "The negotiation has stalled here," he said, his voice trying to sound neutral but thick with suspicion. Richard Hale, always sharp, leaned forward with a half-smile that seemed more like a premonition of attack, ready to savor someone else's mistake. Charles Wentworth kept his arms crossed, watching Ruth as if she were facing an experiment whose failure he had already anticipated. Only Edward Langford showed any real willingness to listen, resting his chin on his hand, waiting with controlled anticipation. The air seemed trapped between the walls of the lounge, as if each unspoken word were louder than the voices present. Ruth, in her impeccable blue uniform and her gloves folded on her lap, leaned over the papers and began reading unhurriedly, but with a firmness that disarmed anxiety. The lines unfolded before her eyes like threads connecting worlds. Ruth read not only the characters, but also the haste of the handwriting, the hesitations, the blank spaces that revealed the writer's emotional state. "Here's the problem," she said clearly, touching her index finger to the section so many had ignored. "The term isn't literal, it's idiomatic. Translated literally, the client would understand that we're taking on a financial risk we would never accept. The expression actually means symbolic commitment, not a formal obligation." With each word, her voice gained weight, and even the most skeptical were forced to follow her train of thought. Patrick leaned over the document, his eyes wide with unexpected clarity. Richard kept his gaze fixed on her, his smile slowly fading, like a glass of ice melting until only water remains. Mrs. Nakamura leaned back in her chair, her red dress standing out like a silent flag, and uttered a single sentence in Japanese. "Accuracy is respect." The comment sounded like a verdict, and everyone knew it wasn't just about translation, but about trust. Adrian Whitmore, standing near the glass window, merely inclined his head in approval, like a conductor satisfied with the first note of a promising symphony. Edward let out a slight smile, discreet but full of meaning. Charles kept his expression serious, but inwardly he was making a mental note that the cleaning lady had passed the first hurdle. Ruth, for her part, didn't celebrate or seek recognition. She simply took a deep breath and realigned her gloves on her lap, as if in a gesture of humility and preparation for the next battle. The silence in the lounge wasn't empty. It was filled with restrained respect, shaken doubts, and the sense that something much greater was just beginning. The message arrived like a gust of icy wind, carried by the rush of a messenger who crossed the lounge with a tense face. "If we mess up again, the pre-agreement is void, and the hotel will be held liable for millions in damages." The words echoed like funeral bells, heavy and indisputable. Charles Wentworth, the skeptic, slammed his briefcase down on the table, scattering even more documents, each page laden with contradictory notes and poorly translated documents. 30 minutes to deliver the final version and present it to the board, he said, his tone unmistakably challenging, as if expecting Ruth to fail. Richard Hale, leaning against the side of the table, crossed his arms and let out a short laugh, an almost cruel sound that seemed to say, "I knew it would end like this." Patrick Collins, still torn between disbelief and curiosity, adjusted his glasses and leaned forward to examine the papers, trying to anticipate the catastrophe. Edward Langford, by contrast, remained silent, but his steady gaze on Ruth revealed a guarded confidence, as if he were silently rooting for her to take the lead. Adrian Whitmore walked slowly to the center of the room and placed a stopwatch on the table, pressing the button that triggered the red hand. It wasn't a threatening gesture, but a clear warning. Time was now the true adversary. Ruth stared at the clock for a moment, then returned her gaze to the documents, determined not to be intimidated by the countdown. Her fingers slid over the sheets, organizing them into piles according to relevance, a movement honed by the discipline acquired from years of working unseen. The pages were filled with traps, loose phrases, cultural terms hidden like landmines that could blow up the entire negotiation. No glamour, just clarity, she muttered softly, more to herself than to the others, before diving into her work. Adrian crossed his arms, watching her carefully, as if assessing the talent of an apprentice about to become a master. As the timer ticked down, the room fell into an almost reverent silence, broken only by the sound of pages turning and the pen scratching out quick, precise corrections. Ruth immersed herself in each sentence as if navigating unknown seas, but with the compass of the invisible experience she carried within her. She remembered the nights she translated letters from Kenji Sato, her father's Japanese friend, sitting in the dim light of a cheap lamp, mentally repeating each word until it sounded natural in her mouth. Precision is kindness to the future, he used to write, and this memory echoed like a mantra in her mind. Richard glanced sideways, waiting for the stumble that never came. Charles kept his chin up, as if he still believed the fall was inevitable. Only Sophie, leaning discreetly against the wall, smiled slightly, acknowledging that she was witnessing a moment no one would dare forget. The hand kept turning, and everyone knew that each second could be the line between ruin and glory. The chronometer's hand ticked relentlessly, marking each second like a war drum that echoed within the minds of those present. Ruth, however, seemed immune to the pressure. Her attentive eyes scanned each line with the assurance of someone familiar with the invisible shortcuts of language. Her steady hands glided over the paper, correcting terms, adjusting expressions, and reconstructing sentences, so that they conveyed not only the literal meaning, but also the cultural respect each clause demanded. Sweat was beginning to dampen her forehead, but she refused to allow herself to be distracted. Richard Hale watched with folded arms, the rigid expression of someone anxiously awaiting failure, while Charles Wentworth rubbed his chin, his lips curled in disdain. Patrick Collins, silent, followed each correction with growing astonishment, and Edward Langford was already sitting up in his chair, sensing he was about to witness something extraordinary. Adrian Whitmore stood motionless, but his calculating eyes followed the cleaning lady's every move like someone watching a rare piece of art in the process of being created. Exactly 28 minutes after the countdown began, Ruth stacked the last document, took a deep breath, and placed her pen firmly on the table, as if it were a final seal of authenticity. The silence that followed was so thick that even the ticking of the timer seemed to have stopped. No one dared to move immediately. Then Adrian broke the weight of the moment with a single word: impeccable. The low but firm tone carried through the room with the force of a verdict. Edward picked up one of the pages, scanned it, and nodded, finding clarity where before there had been only noise. Patrick scanned another passage, searching for flaws like a critic seeking to justify his disbelief, but found nothing but absolute coherence. Richard kept his face straight, but the rigidity in his shoulders betrayed that something inside him was beginning to give way. Sophie, leaning against the wall, couldn't help but smile slightly, knowing she was witnessing a moment that would forever change everyone's perception. It was at that moment that the doors burst open, and Alexander Sterling entered the lounge like a silent storm. His gaze swept across the table, landing first on the stacked documents, then on the executives, and finally on Ruth. He said nothing immediately, simply walking to the head of the table, picking up a sheet of paper, and quickly scanning it, his brow furrowed. "I want this argued to the board in 5 minutes," he said, dry and direct, before dropping the sheet back onto the table. His tone left no room for negotiation. It was an order, and Sterling's order outweighed any written rule. The air filled with tension, with no one daring to volunteer. But before the silence could weigh down again, Ruth stood up, the documents firmly in her hands. Her blue uniform and yellow gloves, now tucked away in her pocket, contrasted with the opulence of the room. Eyes fixed on her, some in disbelief, others defiant, but all aware that the cleaning lady had just accepted a role that could change not just that meeting, but her entire life. The council chamber felt like a silent courtroom, a space where even the air seemed heavier than usual, laden with formality and stories of decisions that cost fortunes. The dark wood walls reflected the cold overhead lights, and the long red carpet muffled footsteps, as if even sounds were controlled within. Ruth entered, clutching the file tightly, sensing the anticipation of everyone around her. The contrast was stark. Her blue uniform and the yellow gloves tucked into her pocket clashed with the impeccably tailored suits and expensive leather briefcases on the table. Alexander Sterling sat at the head of the room, his posture erect, the sharp gaze of a predator accustomed to dictating fates. Charles Wentworth straightened his jacket, ready to test every word. Richard Hale was already sharpening skepticism in his closed expression. Patrick Collins held his hand over a pen, as if each note were a sentence. Edward Langford, more composed, remained poised as if he wanted to listen. And Sophie Carter, discreetly positioned at the back of the room, watched silently, rooting for Ruth with eyes that shone with hope. Ruth took a deep breath, opened the file, and began to speak. Her voice wasn't loud, but it had a firmness that filled the space, like a controlled flame that warms without needing to roar. She clearly explained every idiomatic nuance that could cost millions if misinterpreted. She showed how a seemingly simple expression carried a cultural trap, ready to transform a promise into a debt. She pinpointed the passage where honor, mistranslated, could be seen as a legal obligation. As she spoke, the executives leaned forward, first in disbelief, then attentive, as if beginning to see something that had always been before them but had never been noticed. Even Alexander, accustomed to grandiose speeches, let his pen rest on the table and simply listened, his eyes fixed on the cleaning lady who now occupied the center of the room's invisible stage. The silence that followed her words was different from the previous one. It wasn't empty. It was filled with weight, with unspoken recognition. Ruth closed the file, kept her hands clasped on top of it, and raised her gaze to meet each of those present. Translation isn't just exchanging words. It's defining responsibilities that cost the future of everyone in this room, she said, and the sentence reverberated like a verdict. Charles cleared his throat, bothered by the undeniable clarity. Richard remained still, but the gleam in his eyes revealed he was rethinking his objections. Patrick took quick, almost feverish notes, as if he didn't want to miss anything. Edward smiled slightly, approving with a restrained gesture. Alexander simply drummed his fingers on the table, and that gesture, coming from him, was worth more than applause. Sophie, in the background, felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. Something had changed. And when something changes in the council, the entire machinery of power must reshuffle. Across the table, Richard Hale straightened his body in his chair, his jaw set like stone, ready to launch the first arrow at the unexpected protagonist. His voice cut through the air like a blade. Specific competence is not a resume. The words, cold and sharp, fell like stones in a lake, creating ripples of discomfort among the executives. He pulled out a new, thicker folder, its pages stuffed with technical terms and legal clauses laden with cultural nuances. With a theatrical gesture, he tossed it into the center of the table, as if it were a litmus test. Show it wasn't luck. Prove it here in front of everyone. The challenge wasn't just against Ruth. It was against the idea that someone without titles could penetrate the invisible walls of power. Charles Wentworth nodded, supporting Richard's gesture with a look of silent approval. Patrick Collins, anxious, adjusted his glasses, while Edward Langford watched silently, his expression serious but the steady eyes of someone who believed Ruth would emerge victorious. Adrian Whitmore, motionless, just tilted his head, as if he had been waiting for just that clash. Ruth remained calm. She picked up the folder, opened it, and began leafing through the documents with the serenity of someone who knows their way around. Her eyes scanned each line with the precision of a magnifying glass that not only sees but understands what's hidden. She quickly found the first trap, a settlement clause written in ambiguous language, whose translation error could cost the entire company millions in damages. "Here's the problem," he said firmly, pointing to the section with his index finger. "In the literal translation, we assume invisible costs. But in the cultural context, the term means only a symbolic, non-binding promise." The explanation fell like a hammer on the silence of the room. Even Richard, accustomed to crushing arguments with ease, was forced to shut his mouth for a few seconds. Charles lifted his chin, uncomfortable at seeing irrefutable logic in the hands of someone he still insisted on underestimating. Patrick began taking notes, this time without irony, recognizing the value of what he was hearing. Mrs. Nakamura, until then silent, leaned back in her chair, her red dress flaming in the soft light of the room, and said a short but meaningful phrase in Japanese. "She sees beyond words." Edward nodded immediately, almost relieved to see that the cleaning lady could defuse even the most cruel challenges. Adrian remained silent, but his eyes shone with the satisfaction of someone who sees a seed germinate before everyone's eyes. Richard, after a few seconds of silence, leaned back in his chair, his posture rigid but his gaze less aggressive. Ruth closed her briefcase, returned it to the center of the table, and adjusted her yellow gloves over her pocket. A gesture simple yet charged with symbolism. The room breathed deeply, as if everyone were realizing that the battle that should have brought her down had only strengthened her. The friction, which had seemed to be the stumbling block in her path, was revealing itself to be the rail that would lead her even further. And when someone proves the impossible before such hard eyes, the game is never the same again. The conference phone blinked its red light, the distinctive sound filling the room like the announcement of an impending earthquake. Alexander Sterling frowned and leaned forward, his hand firmly on the table. "It's Tokyo," he said dryly, and the sentence was enough to freeze every breath. Across the ocean, four Japanese executives waited in a video conference, demanding quick answers to save a billion-dollar contract that was already hanging by a thread. Previous attempts by interpreters had failed, distorting idioms and eroding trust almost irreparably. "We have an hour before they end negotiations for good," Alexander continued, his voice thick with urgency and irritation. Richard Hale arched an eyebrow, his look hinting that this would be the moment Ruth would finally be unmasked. Charles Wentworth adjusted his tie, as if to maintain a semblance of control. Patrick Collins fidgeted nervously with his papers, while Edward Langford remained serene, hope firmly in his eyes. Adrian Whitmore, motionless, seemed to already know what the outcome would be. Ruth took a deep breath, slowly approaching the monitor. The reflection of her blue uniform contrasted with the illuminated screen, and the yellow gloves tucked into her pocket seemed to symbolically convey the silent courage she carried within. The Japanese voices began quickly, intensely, full of formalities and nuances. It was like a raging river where any wrong step could drag everything to ruin. Ruth kept her eyes fixed on the screen, letting her ears immerse themselves in every sound, every intonation. It wasn't enough to understand words. She had to decipher the hidden intentions between lines and gestures. She soon realized the root of the problem. A cultural expression had been translated as an obligation, when in fact it was simply a polite greeting, equivalent to "we are together in our hearts." This simple but devastating error had driven the company into a corner. Ruth straightened her shoulders, feeling the weight of the entire room on her, and decided to intervene. With a slight nod, he asked to speak and bowed respectfully before the screen. His voice was calm but firm, in impeccable Japanese. "Forgive us for the confusion earlier. The true intention is to express mutual respect and moral commitment, not contractual obligation." The effect was immediate. Across the room, the executives glanced at each other, some frowning, others relaxing their shoulders, as if finally understood. One of them, an older man, inclined his head in approval, and another gave a slight smile, a sign that the mood had changed. Alexander, sitting at the head of the table, watched silently, but the rigidity in his jaw softened for the first time that morning. Richard Hale looked away, uncomfortable with how his prediction of failure dissolved before his very eyes. Edward took a deep breath of relief, while Sophie, in the corner of the room, bit her lip to contain her emotion. Ruth remained composed, as if she hadn't just rescued a multimillion-dollar contract with a single sentence. But everyone knew that the impossible had just happened, and the fate of that company would never be the same. Late that afternoon, the executive floor was quieter than ever, as if everyone was still processing what they had witnessed. The official report of the meeting was projected on the tactical room's large screen, the colorful graphics taking up the entire wall, but no one paid attention to them. What really mattered was written in stark black letters, just below the translation section. Prepared by Ruth Morgan. For a few seconds, no one commented. The mere fact that that name, the cleaning ladies, was engraved on an official document was like a pebble dropped into a still pond. Sophie Carter felt her heart race. That detail was small to some, but to her it represented a quiet revolution. Patrick Collins leaned forward, examining the screen as if needing to make sure he was actually reading what he was seeing. Charles Wentworth cleared his throat, uncomfortable with the officialization of something he had previously tried to deny. Edward Langford allowed himself a slight smile, pleased to see that justice had been served. Even Richard Hale, reluctantly, took longer than usual to look away. Ruth, however, didn't celebrate or raise her voice. Sitting discreetly in the back, she stood erect, watching her own name flash across the screen, as if it were a mark etched into the glass of history. The yellow gloves, tucked into her pocket, seemed heavier than ever, loaded with symbolism. They were a reminder of where she came from, but also proof that she didn't need to shed her own identity to be recognized. Adrian Whitmore crossed the hallway at that moment, his silent footsteps echoing on the thick carpet. As he passed Ruth, he leaned in just enough to murmur, "Tomorrow, rooftop, not with polish, with a pen." The phrase, simple and direct, made it clear that her path was changing irreversibly. Ruth lowered her eyes, absorbing the meaning. She was no longer just a cleaner who wiped banisters and tables. Now she had become part of decisions that shaped contracts and futures. In the hallway, Alexander Sterling suddenly appeared, his presence filling the space as it always did. He didn't comment on the report or the name everyone had seen, but stood behind the audience, his eyes fixed on the screen for a few seconds. The mere fact that he remained there, silent, was unusual. Alexander rarely lingered on details, but in that moment, he lingered longer than usual. Then he turned and left without a word, but his absence said more than any speech could. Sophie, watching the scene, understood. Sometimes the greatest recognition comes not in the form of applause or praise, but in the silent respect of those who normally don't waste time on what they consider non-essential. Ruth took a deep breath, stood slowly, and straightened her blue uniform. She walked toward the elevator, knowing that each step was now accompanied by different looks. The weight of her name on the screen had changed not only her life, but also the perception of everyone in that building. And this was only the beginning. The next morning, the executive wing seemed to breathe a different air. The aroma of strong coffee mingled with the faint leather scent of the briefcases and the shine of polishes that had never touched Ruth Morgan's hands. She arrived punctually, wearing the same blue uniform, but this time with a simple briefcase in her hands, replacing the cleaning cart that had accompanied her for years. Each step she took echoed in the curious silence of the hallways, as if even the soft carpet was aware of her presence. Eyes followed her discreetly, some of disbelief, others of silent admiration. Ruth felt the weight of these gazes, but didn't let them shake her. She walked with the serenity of someone who always knew that discipline was the key to survival, even when no one believed in her. Arriving at her new workspace, among tall shelves filled with technical books and an organized desk, she took a deep breath, absorbing the feeling that she had definitively crossed into new territory. Sophie Carter was the first to approach, carrying a carefully prepared cup of coffee. She didn't say much, just placing it on the table with a discreet smile, a small but meaningful gesture. Patrick Collins appeared soon after, carrying a sheaf of heavy documents. "No rush, but no mistakes," he said, placing them on the table as if it were a disguised test. Ruth simply nodded, accepting the challenge without needing words. Charles Wentworth entered soon after, watching her with appraising eyes, as if measuring the strength of the new foundation rising before him. Richard Hale passed by in the hallway, gave her a brief glance, but this time there was no disdain in his eyes, only caution. Edward Langford stopped in the doorway, leaned against the frame, and watched silently, like a guardian who already knew the outcome. Adrian Whitmore, from afar, merely inclined his head slightly, as if confirming that the piece was exactly where it should be on the board. Ruth opened the folder and began to work. Her hands, accustomed to scrubbing banisters and cleaning glass, now ran through pages filled with legal terms, adjusting clauses, translating passages, and eliminating ambiguities that could cost millions. The pace was different, but the precision was the same. Every detail treated with the same discipline she applied to polishing brass to a shine. Gradually, a respectful silence took over the room, broken only by the sound of her quick notes and the gentle turning of pages. Sophie, still in the background, watched with shining eyes, aware that she was witnessing the birth of a new figure at the heart of the company. Ruth felt, for the first time, that she occupied this position not out of charity, but out of merit. Still, she knew that the true test would not be simply staying there, but proving every day that her presence was indispensable. And the first great challenge would come sooner than she imagined. Richard Hale took the floor during that morning's tactical meeting, his firm voice cutting through the air like a sword thrust. "One-off victories can be celebrated, but what interests me are replicable results," he declared, staring directly at Ruth Morgan, as if to test her in public. With a calculated gesture, he opened a folder even larger than the one from the night before and spread documents across the table. They were complex contracts, full of dialect variations, technical clauses, and absurd deadlines, like a wall erected to block any boldness. The provocation was clear. Richard wanted to prove that Ruth's success had been merely a flash of luck. Charles Wentworth adjusted his tie, approving the move with a slight nod. Patrick Collins adjusted his glasses and stood attentively, eager to see how she would react. Edward Langford crossed his arms, worried but confident. Adrian Whitmore, standing in the background, watched with that impenetrable gaze of someone who knows that a student only grows when challenged beyond comfort. Ruth didn't back down. She pulled the stack of documents toward her, organizing them into smaller groups, as if transforming a giant into several smaller, manageable adversaries. She started with the first, a contract that hid financial risks masked by polite expressions. She calmly explained how a literal translation would transform a polite phrase into a multimillion-dollar obligation. Then she moved on to the second, an exclusivity clause whose error could compromise the company's entire negotiating freedom. Finally, she tackled the third, a confidentiality agreement written in language so formal that it concealed dangerous loopholes. With each explanation, her voice sounded precise, calm, yet charged with authority. Patrick leaned closer and closer to listen, his eyes wide with clarity. Charles, uncomfortable, chewed on the tip of his pen, trying to find a way to object. Richard kept his gaze fixed, but the defiant smile on his face was slowly fading. When she finished, Ruth returned the last sheet to the table, folded her hands in her lap, and kept her gaze firmly fixed on the executives. The silence that followed was heavy, but not uncomfortable. It was the silence of acknowledgement. Patrick finally broke the mood with a simple but admiring comment. "This isn't just translation, it's strategy." Charles didn't respond, but his deep sigh revealed he was surrendered, even against his will. Richard, after a few seconds of hesitation, leaned back in his chair and simply said, "Okay." The short, dry word was more powerful than any compliment, because coming from him, it meant the resistance had been overcome. Edward smiled discreetly, pleased to see Ruth's silent victory. Adrian, without changing his expression, simply inclined his head, as if confirming that the lesson had been learned. Ruth knew that this confrontation had been designed to tear her down, but it ended up becoming the definitive proof that she belonged at that table. And deep down, even Richard knew that from then on, there was no longer any way to ignore her. The next morning, the meeting room was full, but the atmosphere felt lighter, as if the air had changed since the recent events. Alexander Sterling opened the daily briefing with his usual objectivity, leafing through the reports without wasting time on unnecessary introductions. "I want to hear in 2 sentences what's changed since yesterday," he said, his gaze sweeping across each face until it settled on Ruth Morgan. The request was simple, but the responsibility weighed like lead. Richard Hale shifted in his chair, anxious to see if she would falter. Charles Wentworth stood still, his eyes half closed as if evaluating a test piece. Patrick Collins was already leaning forward, curious about the answer. Edward Langford waited silently, confident. Sophie Carter, in the background, had her eyes shining, hoping Ruth would find the right words. And Adrian Whitmore, with his arms crossed, seemed to already know she wouldn't fail. Ruth took a deep breath and stood. Her voice didn't need to be loud, but it carried the firmness of someone who knows the weight of her own words. "Translation isn't just exchanging words," she said calmly and clearly. "It's signing responsibilities that cost the future of everyone in this room." The impact was immediate. Alexander put his pen down on the table and leaned back in his chair, reflecting on the sentence. Charles, surprised, raised his eyebrows slightly, recognizing a logic he couldn't dispute. Richard, even annoyed, couldn't hide the tension that was fading from his expression. Patrick wrote down each word quickly, as if he'd just heard a rare lesson. Edward inclined his head in approval. Sophie almost smiled, proud to see that Ruth not only mastered contracts but also knew how to summarize their essence in a few lines. Adrian remained silent, but his eyes fixed on her conveyed absolute respect. Alexander broke the silence, saying simply, "It works." And when the most powerful man in the room utters that word, it's as if a sentence has been decreed. Sophie muttered something to herself, jotting Ruth's words down in her personal notebook, determined never to forget them. Patrick was already considering turning those words into official protocol. Edward saw them as a guideline for future negotiations. Even Charles, reluctantly, suggested they be recorded as part of the company's internal policy. Richard didn't smile, but looked away as if admitting, without confessing, that he was convinced. Ruth, silent, simply sat back down, her eyes fixed on the papers before her. She knew that, in that moment, she had crossed the invisible line between being tolerated and being respected. And once respect is born in a boardroom, it can no longer be taken away. The mood in the room had changed completely, and everyone knew it, especially her. The wind from the terrace blew cold and steady, carrying with it the metallic smell of the city mixed with the subtle scent of the flowers that adorned the space. Ruth Morgan rested her simple notebook on the glass railing and let her eyes travel the horizon, where skyscrapers cut into the sky like sharp blades. That place, from where she could see almost everything, seemed to symbolize the exact point where her life had changed. She closed her eyes for a moment and remembered Kenji Sato's letters, the words written in dark ink, each firm correction, each piece of advice that guided her. Precision is kindness to the future. She repeated the phrase softly, as if reciting a silent prayer. Sophie Carter approached quietly, carrying a cup of hot tea. She didn't need to say anything. She simply stood beside her, silent, because she knew that some victories don't call for celebration, but for contemplation. Downstairs, in the service yard, Daniel Rivera was pushing a heavy cart and lifted his chin when he saw Ruth. The gesture was small, almost imperceptible, but it carried pride and recognition. Beside him, Ethan Brooks, the young bellhop, smiled broadly, showing teeth and eyes of genuine enthusiasm, as if he had been rooting for her from the start and now celebrated the victory as his own. Ruth inclined her head slightly in response, not exaggerated, but full of meaning. These simple gestures held the world together, even if they didn't appear in reports or contracts. They were small signs that her presence was no longer going unnoticed. Meanwhile, on the executive floor, a few discreet comments were circulating through the halls. "She's talented. I never imagined a cleaning lady could. We need her more often." The voices weren't all approving, but even the skeptics were beginning to admit that Ruth had made a name for herself. Adrian Whitmore appeared on the terrace, the wind gently ruffling his neatly combed hair. He didn't say anything right away. He stood beside Ruth for a few seconds, observing the city below as if checking that everything was still in order. Then, without taking his eyes off the horizon, he commented, "Tomorrow, without a net." Ruth didn't need to ask what he meant. She understood immediately. Nets are for apprentices, but she was no longer a beginner. She tucked her notebook into her pocket and felt the responsibility grow. She was ready to face new challenges without support, trusting only in her own skill. Sophie, beside her, smiled discreetly, realizing this was yet another rite of passage. Ruth took a deep breath, letting the cold wind wash away any remaining insecurity. She knew that, from then on, every word translated, every decision made, wouldn't be just work. It would be living proof that dignity and competence don't choose uniforms, but reveal themselves in moments when the world least expects them. The board was meeting again, but this time the atmosphere seemed even more tense, as if everyone knew this meeting could define not just a contract, but the future of the company. The long table was covered in open folders, tablets laden with documents, and forgotten cups of coffee. Mrs. Nakamura, in her elegant red dress, occupied one of the main seats, conveying the quiet authority of someone carrying centuries of tradition in her restrained gestures. On the screen in the background, the representatives from Tokyo appeared in a video conference, their serious faces illuminated by the bluish glow of the camera. Charles Wentworth spoke solemnly, introducing the context, while Patrick Collins tried to align glossaries in real time. Richard Hale maintained a rigid posture, ready to intervene at the slightest sign of error. Edward Langford, attentive, followed every detail, while Adrian Whitmore stood in the background, his gaze fixed on Ruth Morgan. And Alexander Sterling, in the center of the table, set the pace with his simple, powerful silence. Ruth stood up slowly, carrying the folder, organized with almost military precision. She placed it on the table, opened the first contract, and let her eyes scan the complicated lines, full of technical terms and cultural expressions untranslatable to laymen. When she began to speak, her voice was calm but firm, like polished steel. She explained every nuance clearly, illuminating obscure points, transforming confusion into understanding. She showed how a single expression could signify both a symbolic commitment and a financial obligation, depending on the cultural context. And, more than translating, she offered solutions that avoided risks and reinforced trust. Mrs. Nakamura leaned forward slowly, her eyes fixed on Ruth, a sign of approval. On the screen, one of the Japanese executives allowed himself a small smile, a rare gesture in such formal situations. The heavy atmosphere began to dissipate, replaced by an atmosphere of resolution. When Ruth concluded her presentation, the room fell into absolute silence. No one dared interrupt the weight of the moment. Even Alexander, known for his haste in cutting speeches short, stood still, his eyes fixed on the folder in front of him. Then, with a calculated gesture, he picked up the pen and signed the final document. "Approved," he said, and the word echoed like a gavel in court. It was more than authorization. It was the consecration that all the effort had been worth it. Sophie Carter, in the corner of the room, felt her eyes well up, while Patrick lowered his head, impressed by the silent lecture he had received. Richard Hale remained silent, but the rigidity of his posture had disappeared, replaced by restrained respect. Charles sighed deeply, as if he had just accepted that resistance was futile. Edward smiled discreetly, satisfied to see justice being served. Ruth calmly closed the folder, pocketed her yellow gloves, and, for the first time, felt she had conquered the last rung of a seemingly impossible ladder. Night fell over the city like a velvet blanket, covering the skyscrapers with thousands of points of light that twinkled like artificial stars. Ruth Morgan descended to the lobby after finishing the most decisive day of her life. The blue uniform still clung to her body, the yellow gloves tucked into her pocket as a silent reminder of her origins she would never deny. He walked slowly, each step echoing in the vastness of the marble hall, but this time he wasn't invisible. Employees who had previously ignored her now greeted her with discreet nods. Daniel Rivera, pushing the cleaning cart, raised his clenched fist in a sign of silent pride, and Ethan Brooks, the young bellhop, smiled broadly, as if he knew he was standing before an example to be followed. Ruth returned the gesture with restraint, having learned that greatness is not measured by the noise it makes, but by the transformation it leaves behind. Stepping out onto the street, she found Sophie Carter, waiting for her, leaning against one of the hotel pillars. The attendant wordlessly handed her a small beige envelope. Ruth opened it carefully and saw only a single sentence written in firm handwriting. The right words changed destinies. There was no signature, but she knew it came from Adrian Whitmore. She tucked the note into her pocket with her gloves, like someone collecting fragments of a legacy built in silence. The night wind blew hard, ruffling her tied-up hair, and she looked up, to the top of the building she had so often climbed with just her gaze, and now had become a protagonist. She felt grateful not for the recognition itself, but for having proven that even those underestimated can carry within them a skill capable of moving mountains. It was a reminder that dignity and preparation always find a way, even in the most closed corridors of power. As she began walking down the sidewalk, wet with the light drizzle, she thought of her mother, of Kenji Sato, of all the days she'd felt invisible. Now she knew she didn't need to raise her voice or demand space. Simply standing firm, being precise, and acting with integrity was enough to write her story. As she turned the corner, the lights reflected in the windows of the buildings seemed to shine a little brighter, as if the entire city recognized her. And in that meaningful silence, Ruth understood she didn't need loud applause. The respect she'd earned was stronger, because it came even from those who had previously despised her. Her journey was living proof that it doesn't matter where you start, but how you approach each page of life. If this story touched your heart, please like it, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. This will help spread more stories of overcoming challenges like Ruth Morgan's.